Today I want to discuss a topic that might be of interest to people who are just getting into competitive Pokemon or people who struggle to understand why certain Pokemon are valued more highly in competitive than others. Maybe your favorite Pokemon or a Pokemon that you happen to like a lot happens to be in a very low tier and people say, oh, that's a bad Pokemon. And you say, no, it's not a bad Pokemon. I love that Pokemon. And that's fine. Many of my favorite Pokemon, in fact, I'd say the majority of my favorite Pokemon would definitely make this list. Only so many Pokemon can be very good Pokemon. But just as in real life, there are very many people who do a lot of things really well, but only a few of us can be the very best, right? How many people want to play for the NBA? How many people can play in the NBA, right? It takes a lot to get to be really good. So don't be offended if your Pokemon happens to be a quote-unquote bad Pokemon. What we do want to discover though today is what makes a Pokemon bad or suboptimal or whatever you want to call it. There are going to be a few categories that we can break it down into and try to identify symptoms of Pokemon that might be bad. Some of those are going to be pretty obvious. Some of them I think are going to be less obvious, and then depending on your experience level, you may have not even thought about any of this before. So I'd just like to go over some of these, and hopefully we can come to some kind of consensus as to how to identify what Pokemon will be good or bad. Or at least bad. Identifying good Pokemon is somehow equally as difficult, or maybe even more so, and will be done in a separate video. Alright, before we start, I do want to make a few things clear. First of all, I'm only considering viability based off of Smogon Singles. Smogon Singles is, of course, representative generally of how good a Pokemon would be in any singles environment, barring things like Moody and other weird cheese strats, because even if you removed tiering from the list, Pokemon like Lilligant are still not going to be able to stand up to Pokemon like Dragapult. So, just singles in general, the reason I have to make this caveat is that VGC and doubles actually has an entirely different feel for a game, and many Pokemon that are good in singles actually end up being very bad in doubles or VGC, and vice versa. So I want to make that abundantly clear, because I don't want people saying, well, this is good in VGC, because that's great, it's good in VGC, but it's not good in singles, and I'm limiting my discussion here today to only singles discussion. Second of all, I want to say that a good Pokemon will be able to inhabit the OU or the UU tier, maybe more so trending towards the OU tier, right? If you're a good Pokemon, you should be able to hang with the big boys, you should be able to take hits, you should be able to put out massive damage, right? You should have something meaningful to contribute to the metagame. Again, only a few Pokemon can even make this in the first place. There's over 900 Pokemon and only like 20 or 30 of them are in the OU tier. So this is a very exclusive club, which is why you could maybe extend it down to UU to make it a little more inclusive. But anything below that I would consider to be not very good. Most of the Pokemon we're going to pull from today, though, fall from the very bottom tiers or even the untiered Pokemon that don't even have a niche in any tier whatsoever. So don't worry, we're going to try to keep it nice and black and white. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is that depending on the metagame, certain Pokemon can rise up or they can fall in usage or viability without any changes to the Pokemon whatsoever. And it'll all depend on their niche and what role they have to fill, and perhaps their role that they usually would fill is just currently not very valuable, and that's fine. So we should sort of consider this to be a look at the current Sword and Shield metagame, and if some things were to change in the future, a few of the mons on this list might see themselves rise or fall accordingly. But most of the Pokemon on this list are perennial bad Pokemon. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go over my 10 ways to make a Pokemon bad. The first and most obvious point for making a bad Pokemon is to have a bad base stat total, or BST for short. A base stat total is just a quick way to look at a Pokemon's stats as a whole. Certain Pokemon, like legendaries, will have a base stat total of about 600 to 700, and many Mega Pokemon often had similar spreads. Pokemon who are meant to be bad, right? Game Freak designed Beedrill and Butterfree to be early game fodder and not very good, or Raticate or something like that. Those Pokemon are going to have very low BSTs in the 400s or maybe even sometimes in the 300s. If you end up like that, those are pretty unsalvageable, especially at the lower ends of the 400s and below. So we won't necessarily worry ourselves with those, because those are just designed to be bad Pokemon and there's not much we can do about it. But until you get to about 500 BST, you are somewhat lacking and falling behind, especially if you consider that most of the Pokemon in the OU tier are either legendary or pseudo-legendary, or are able to get close to that BST of 600 or so. So I would say anything below 550 is already going to have a bad time, and most of the Pokemon on this list, maybe about half at least, have below that, and so that's already a struggle. But anything below 500 I would say is pretty unworkable, and we would need to buff it. The second problem that you can have with your stats maybe isn't that you don't have good stat total, but though the stats that you do have aren't put into the proper stat. And what I mean by that is maybe I have a lot of special attack and attack, but I want it to be a physical attacker. I don't need to have a high special attack stat. That's sort of silly. Why do I have a high special attack stat? And there are multiple Pokemon that have this problem. So if I had taken some of those stat points away from my special attack and put it into physical attack or speed or defense, then I might be way better as a result. And so maybe your allocation is the thing that's holding you back. The next one, and one that you may not have thought of before, is that a Pokemon with a single type is generally not going to be very good. There are a few types that buck this trend. Water and Fairy are two types that actually performed decently on their own, but this is due to two factors. First of all, they usually have very spammable moves. Water types, especially special attackers, have Scald, and special Fairy types have Moonblast. Both of those are very good moves to spam all the time. And the other thing is that Fairy and Water types are both good defensive typings on their own. You don't need any more typing than Water or Fairy to have a good defensive typing, and so you can either have an offensive niche or a defensive niche, and those are generally fine. But I will say that you could always get better than that, right? Water Fairy is in and of itself one of the best typings in the game, and Water or Fairy alone is going to be inferior to that, generally speaking. That's just one example. And then really the reason why you want to have more than one typing is multiple, but one of the main ones is because you want to do more damage. Now, a Pokemon gets what's called a same type attack bonus, or what I'll call stab. And stab means that I get 50% more damage done with attacks that match my type. So if I am a Ralts, I would get more damage off of my Psychic and my Fairy type moves because that matches my typing. And so that makes sense. I would expect, a Fire type to be more adept with a Fire move than maybe a Psychic type would be, and so it should do more damage with said Fire type moves. And so Game Freak has implemented this stab mechanic, and that means that if I want to do more damage, I should have multiple types, because then I can have multiple type of moves that will do more damage as a result, whereas a Pokemon with only a single type can only do more damage with one type of move, and any other coverage moves are going to be weaker as a result. Additionally, generally speaking, there are better offensive or defensive combinations that you can make with multiple types as opposed to having the one single type, and that's your only option. As an example, maybe I am a fighting type, and a fighting type would struggle with a flying type. But if I'm a fighting and an electric type, well, now I can cover for that flying type weakness and actually scare out said flying type, right? So that would be a really strong dual typing that would cover my weaknesses offensively. Defensively, of course, Fairy Steel is a good example of a synergistic combo because Fairy is weak to poison and steel. Steel makes you neutral to steel and immune to poison. And so Fairy Steel is a very good synergistic defensive typing and is probably the best typing in the game, just overall. Now, number 4 on my list of problems you can have as a Pokemon is a lack of coverage. And what I mean by that is I need to be able to hit multiple Pokemon that are going to come in on me. I maybe Ralts, so I have Psychic and Fairy moves, and a Steel type is going to resist both of those. So if I have a Fighting type move or a Ground type move or a Fire type move at my disposal, I can hit the Steel type with that. I can either predict it switching in and hit it then, or if they're low enough on HP and I can kill it with one of those moves, then I can just, save it for the next turn and that's fine. But if I don't have those coverage moves, then I will always be forced to switch out, and I won't get very much damage off on the Pokemon coming in. So a good Pokemon will have good coverage options, and a bad Pokemon, obviously the inverse of that, will not have good coverage options. Now there are some exceptions to that. Some defensive Pokemon really only have one move that they ever need to click, right? Toxapex could get away with just having a Scald, and it would be just fine. But offensive Pokemon especially need to have good coverage options. Number 5, and this is a bit of a weird one, is the lack of a niche. Now there are certain Pokemon that are there to hit hard, and there are certain Pokemon that are there to take hits. But then there are other Pokemon that need to have a specific role because they don't hit as hard as the other ones, or they don't take hits as well. And those Pokemon need to be able to get rid of hazards, or they need to be able to heal their teammates, or they need to be able to have some kind of ability that will boost their power in some form or fashion. Maybe like a speed boosting Pokemon would be an example of that, right? Scolipede was not very good, and as soon as it got speed boost, now it has a niche, it has a role it can play that is different from other Pokemon. So having a niche can really save a Pokemon if the raw numbers don't add up. Similarly, for number 6, a competition is a big problem. There are so many Pokemon that are Psychic and Fairy, for instance. There is Hatterene, there's Gardevoir, there's Tapu Lele, there's Rapidash, and there might be 1 or 2 others that I'm not thinking of. Mr. Mime. So, out of all of those, which one would you choose if you had to add one to your team? Well, you're going to choose Tapu Lele almost always, because Tapu Lele is stronger, faster, and has Psychic Terrain, which is a valuable move, or a valuable ability, and has a lot of different moves at its disposal that maybe some of the other ones don't have. Of course, Hatterene can make itself differentiated by having Magic Bounce and having Trick Room, and so obviously the two Pokemon aren't the same, but they do compete in the same type space, and so if you want to stand out, you have to have something different. Something like Mr. Mime, however, doesn't really have too much going for it that would make it more valuable than Tapu Lele, and so would just be a clearly inferior Pokemon. Power creep can play into this in 2 ways. First of all, earlier Pokemon, especially Gen 1, Gen 2 Pokemon, they maybe don't have as many base stats as the later Gen Pokemon, or they don't have as good of a stat distribution for whatever reason. And so as time goes on, Pokemon that come out that are new will oftentimes supplant Pokemon that used to be quite good. For instance, Flygon used to be able to hang in the OU tier no problem, but nowadays the Flygon would not be able to do much in the OU tier because it's just not fast or strong enough to do much of anything, because everything has just gotten faster and stronger and bulkier. Power creep doesn't necessarily have to do with the Pokemon that you're competing with as much as it has to do with just Pokemon you're fighting. If the Pokemon are faster or stronger than you, then you can't really cut it in the tier that you're in. So those two sort of are a similar concept. Number 7 is bad offensive typing. If I have 2 types that don't really complement each other on the offensive side, then even though it may be a unique typing and a cool typing thematically, if it's just not strong offensively, if it doesn't give me much value to my team, then it's not going to be very good offensive typing. Similarly, bad defensive typing would be something that just can't take hits when it's supposed to, or certain types just aren't good defensively, like ice, right? Most ice types just are bad defensive Pokemon, and that's just how it is, right? And you don't fault them for it, but that's going to be an initial issue because of the way the ice type is. It only resists ice, and it's weak to very many things, so can't really solve that one. So generally speaking for a Pokemon, if they are an offensive Pokemon, I will only consider bad offensive typing if that's a problem, or bad defensive typing if that's a problem for a defensive Pokemon, with a few exceptions. But I won't fault a Pokemon that's supposed to be offensive for having bad defensive typing, because nobody complains that Weavile has bad defensive typing because it's meant to be offensive, it's not meant to be defensive. Number 9 is unreliability. If a Pokemon has moves that miss, or it has an ability that makes it miss, or if it has an ability or move that might be crucial to it, but it doesn't really get to use it very much or in an effective fashion, then it's not really going to get much value in any particular game, and that will be unreliable. And you'll see more what I mean by that when we get into the specific examples. Finally, and this is sort of a rarer occurrence, but there are certain Pokemon that may have an ability or a move that is banned in a specific tier, and would otherwise make them really quite good, but because that ability or move is banned, and this is where we get into more specific stuff for Smogon, then that Pokemon becomes bad. Bibarel, for instance, has the Moody ability that got banned, therefore Bibarel is a terrible Pokemon. It still wouldn't be the greatest, even if it had a Moody ability, but it was quite a terror when it was allowed for a while, and we're not going to do that. So, another example would be Wobbuffet. Wobbuffet needs its Shadow Tag ability to be able to do anything, otherwise the Pokemon will just switch out and ignore Wobbuffet entirely. So, Wobbuffet is fine if it has Shadow Tag, but if Shadow Tag is banned, like it is in Smogon, until it gets to Ubers, then Wobbuffet just can't do his job at all, and will fall to being, a very bad Pokemon. And Wobbuffet isn't on this list, but I just wanted to point that out as an example of a Pokemon that would be a fine Pokemon if it didn't have its ability to be banned. Alright, so those are the 10 ways that I have enumerated that a Pokemon can be bad in. And I want to now go over 20 examples of Pokemon that I consider to be bad just because of how they're tiered and also from their performance aspects. I have played a lot of Pokemon, and I know these Pokemon just aren't as good as other options that you have available to you. And so I want to talk about why that is. So let's get into it. Alright, so the first Pokemon we have on the list is Magmortar. Magmortar is a fire type. It's usually ran as a special attacker. If you look at its base stats, you can see that it has a pretty decent 125 special attack stat. If you get above 120 or so, that's pretty workable. And 95 attack is mentioned here specifically because if you want to run some kind of coverage option, 95 isn't the worst. You generally don't want to have that be your main stat that you're attacking off of, but if you need to have some cheeky coverage option, 95 ain't bad. Run Earthquake on Magmortar, for instance. Nowadays it has Scorching Sand, so it doesn't have to run Earthquake, but back in the day, that would be an option. Now, generally speaking, Magmortar is a special attacker, and a special attacker wants to be able to outspeed things and hit them really hard. And 83 speed is not really that great. It is faster than a lot of Pokemon, it's faster than most bulky Pokemon, but anything that's offensively oriented is going to generally hit at least like 90. And so 83 is not a very good speed tier. You're going to get outsped by quite a lot of things, and your defenses aren't great. So you're not going to be able to be really tanky, and as a result, you're going to get outsped by a lot of the offensive mons. So let's look at our list of problems you can have and see which ones Magmortar suffers from. It does not have a bad BST. 540 is pretty dang good. Bad stat allocation, however, I think is a big problem. For instance, that 83 speed, not looking so great. Single typing is a big problem. It has a lot of coverage moves, so it does not suffer from that at all. Magmortar doesn't really have a niche. if you look at fire attackers, there are good mono fire attackers like Darmanitan, and there are many fire attackers like Charizard that can do its job because they have dual typing, and Magmortar doesn't have that option. And besides that, its abilities don't really give it a niche other than, cool, it can't get put to sleep. And that's fine. Flame Body, though, is not really much of a niche, so I'm not considering that. Now, I mentioned before there were all sorts of other fire attackers out there that do the job better than Magmortar. There are ones that are faster, there are ones that hit way harder, there are ones that can do something else like Torkoal, for instance. Torkoal is a mono fire Pokemon, but it can set the sun with Drought. That's a niche that it can fill that's going to be way more valuable than Magmortar, which just, hits hard and has decent coverage. So it's not really that useful. There are quite a few bulky special walls that can come in, beat Magmortar's hits, shrug them off, and force it to switch out. It doesn't really have any good boosting options outside of Belly Drum, and I would say Belly Drum is maybe Magmortar's one niche, but it's such a gimmick that I didn't feel like mentioning it. Now, as far as offensive typing, Fire is fine. It's not trying to be defensive, so we don't have to worry about that. And it is somewhat unreliable. Now, Fire Blast is its strongest move other than Overheat, and Fire Blast can miss. If you're missing, that's a problem. Also, its coverage includes Focus Blast, and it does need Focus Blast for certain Pokemon. And Focus Blast is, of course, as everybody knows, quite unreliable. If you have to rely on Fire Blast and Focus Blast, that is going to give you some reliability issues. However, you can run Flamethrower and you can run Overheat, so you have options to overcome the unreliability issue, but it still is something to be concerned about. It doesn't have any problems with getting its abilities or moves banned, but let's take a look at those abilities. Flame Body and Vital Spirit, those are both defensive abilities. One of them burns your opponent if they touch you. Well, Magmortar doesn't want to get touched. With that 67 base defense, it's not going to be able to take very many hits. And Vital Spirit means it can't get put to sleep. Well, that could be considered somewhat of an offensive move because I can switch into something like a Vileplume that wants to put me to sleep. That, first of all, means that my opponent has to have something to put me to sleep with, which many teams do not, in which case my ability might as well not even be there at all. And it also means that they have to be specifically trying to put me to sleep, which, I guess they could, but it isn't a likely scenario. So generally, you're not going to get much value out of either of these abilities. So ways to fix up Magmortar, I would say give it higher speed, right? You have that 95 base SpDef. You could reallocate these stats here, take the 95 in SpDef, put it into speed, and put the 83 back into the SpDef. If you did that, then it would hit 95 speed tier. 95 speed tier is like Tapu Lele. That's not too bad. You can work with 95 speed. I would give it a new ability as well. It has only 2 abilities, so it has an empty slot. It would totally be fine to give it a 3rd ability. You could give it something like Mega Launcher. I think Mega Launcher would be super cool on Magmortar. Give it a signature move that's like a flamethrower or like a flame... a flame cannon move of some sort that would be boosted by Mega Launcher, and then give it Dark Pulse and Aura Sphere, and then it can run Thunderbolt or Scorching Sands in the last slot, and that would actually be incredibly threatening. You could also give it Drought as well. That would give it a niche as a Sun Setter, but also mean that its fire moves are going to torch lots of Pokemon. You have a few options that would be more offensively oriented that I think you could play around with. Finally, if you gave Magmortar a good form of priority, maybe something like a Cellarrock, but it's fire and special, then that could be useful because Magmortar is quite slow and it could use any kind of priority it can get. That being said, fire is okay priority, but only in certain scenarios, so I wouldn't necessarily rely on that, and I don't think that alone would help my Magmortar stand out beyond just, the lower tiers. Alright, next up is Jinx. Now, similar to Magmortar, Jinx is a special attacker, and it has a really bad BST. You can see that it only has 455 total stats, and 115 special attack is not great. It's not terrible, but 115, especially in the higher tiers, is pretty low. And 95 is workable. It is about top related speed tier, so that's fine. But you're definitely going to get outsped by a lot of really strong attackers. And let's look at those defenses. You can see that it only has 65 HP, which is not great, and 35 defense, which is abysmal. So it's not going to be able to take any hits, and even with that 95 base speed being average, the average is not really great when you don't have any way to take any hits, because you got Pokemon like Dragapult, Pokemon like Zeraora, Pokemon like Weavile that are all going to outspeed you. Anything that hits base 100 speed tier is going to outspeed you. You're going to speed tie with a lot of 95s, and Pokemon like Urshifu even outspeed you, and they're going to kill you with close combat. You don't really outspeed anything that's meaningful. So if you want it to be a glass cannon with these low defenses, you would need to have a higher speed stat. So that bad BST right out of the gate is a major drawback for Jinx. I don't know why they haven't buffed her or given her something to help her mitigate this bad BST, but they may just be trying to ignore Jinx because of all the controversy. I don't know. Now, stat allocation wise, it's fine because she does have high attack and speed, or at least they're aiming for high attack and speed. So the allocation is fine, it's just she doesn't have the stats. Dual typing, that's good. Lack of coverage is sort of there. Jinx does have Focus Blast, and that's crucial, but besides that, not much else going on here. Jinx does have a niche in being able to have Lovely Kiss and put Pokemon to sleep. Lovely Kiss is superior to Hypnosis and just barely hits the threshold for being usable. So you can use Lovely Kiss and then get a nasty plot up or two. And that's it. That is quite useful. It also has the niche of having Dry Skin, which means it's immune to water type moves, which is often useful for setting up on Pokemon as well. So it does have a couple niches which do make it somewhat useful, but definitely not something that's going to inherently make it a good Pokemon. Now, it is a special attacker, Ice and Psychic, and there's a lot of competition for those slots. And in terms of power creep, the stats just aren't enough to keep up. So I don't even have to explain why that has been power crept to hell and back. Bad offensive typing. If you get walled by Steel type, that's not good. Again, Jinx has Focus Blast, but there are Pokemon like Corviknight which are going to be neutral to Focus Blast and are going to be quite bulky to the point where you better have at least 2 nasty plots up if you want to do any kind of serious damage, and then you just better hope that they don't kill you in return because you have 35 base defense. So and that's the best case scenario, really. You probably are going to hit Focus Blast, which is why I think that just the typing in and of itself inherently puts you in an awkward position, because Ice doesn't cover anything Steel's worried or Psychic's worried about. Psychic is worried about Steel. Ice does not help. It hurts, in fact. The dark types of the tier and the ghost types, Ice isn't helping you with, and Psychic doesn't help against very much that Ice cares about. It does help against fighting types, which is cool, but only insofar that you can hit them super effectively. If they have Mach Punch or Bullet Punch, you're going down, and that's not going to help you then at the end of the day. He's not a defensive Pokemon, so I'm not worried about his defensive capabilities, not that it has any. And it is quite unreliable. If you're relying on Lovely Kiss to get a sweep going, that's a major problem. You may not hit most of the time. And similarly with Focus Blast, if you need to get that hit on Registeel or on Stakataka or whatever Steel type is coming in on you, and you miss it for whatever reason, well, now you're dead. And so that means that a lot of these games that you're playing with Jinx are going to come up to dumb luck, and that's not the sign of a good Pokemon. So, how to fix Jinx? First of all, needs more stats. Give it a bit more defense, maybe bring it up to at least base 50 or 60. Give it definitely at least 10 more points in special attack, and speed is okay, I guess. Maybe 5 more points in speed just to make it base 100, but I really don't know if you could justify that too much. It definitely needs more stats. And then I would give Lovely Kiss better accuracy. Maybe if you make base 90, 95 accuracy, that would be annoying, especially if you don't have Sleep Claws in your game. But then it would at least give a Jinx less of a hard time when it comes to hitting its RNG based moves, right? Lovely Kiss, Focus Blast, both of those really spotty accuracy. That's a big problem when you're trying to set up and get sweeps going. And that's the only thing you can do with Jinx is get sweeps because it doesn't have any staying power. So, very unreliable Pokemon and needs a lot of work to get anywhere. Next up, let's talk about a legendary Pokemon. Now, legendary Pokemon, you think, oh, legendary Pokemon are supposed to be good, but not all legendary Pokemon are created equal. And I could have a full legendary team that was complete garbage. And many Pokemon on this list will be legendary. So just because the Pokemon says it's a legendary Pokemon does not in any way, shape, or form mean that your team is going to be OP. In fact, it could be very bad, depending on which ones you choose. Now, Mesprit can be a special attacker. It can also be a support Pokemon. It often takes the role of a support Pokemon, and we will see that the reason for that is based off of its stat distribution. So, base 80 HP is fine. It has 105 for both of its attack stats, and 105 is not great. It's still above a base 100, so that's good, but 105 is not good. You at least want to hit 120 to have any chance of being okay and doing damage. So 105 is not good. Now, however, Mesprit does have Nasty Plot, so it can boost its attack stat in that way, and so that is something to consider. So it isn't the end of the world for Mesprit offensively, but it still isn't going to be hitting out of the box very well. And his defensive stats are 105 as well, and 105 for a defensive stat actually isn't too bad, especially if you have 80 HP. You can make that serviceable. 80 speed though, not good. If you're a defensive Pokemon, that's fine, and Uxie definitely makes it work, but Mesprit doesn't have the greatest defenses. They're just okay, and it doesn't have great attack stat. So if it wants to be an attacker, 80 is too low, and if it wants to be defensive, well, 80 is fine, but couldn't we have put that into the HP stat so I was really tanky? I don't know. Something to consider. That total comes out to 580, which is going to be one of the highest ones we see on this list. So you think, you can't complain with the 580, but again, why do I have 105 attack stat? If I want to be a special attacker, all of that attack is going to waste. And so my BST is not bad, but my stat allocation is horrible. I don't do well as a physical attacker or a special attacker, and I have too much attack or special attack for a bulky Pokemon, and I have too much bulk for a attacking Pokemon. So what is Mesprit trying to be? It's a jack of all trades and a master of none. It also has a single typing, which is not doing it any favors. Psychic typing is not what it was in Gen 1, and it really doesn't do too much by itself. You have to have coverage. You have to have fighting, fairy coverage, things like that to get through dark types, and fighting is also useful to get through a lot of steel types. Mesprit also has a distinct lack of coverage. Now, Mesprit is similar to Azelf and Uxie, and a lot of times people don't really know what the difference is between them. But for example, Mesprit does not get Focus Blast, and if you don't get fighting type coverage as a psychic type, you're going to have a bad time. Mesprit gets Drain Punch and Power Punch, and that's as far as it goes in terms of fighting coverage. And you can see that it has, that 105 attack stat, so that's fine, but it doesn't have Sword Stance to bulk up or to get powered up on the physical side. So the 105 physical attack is not great. And also, Psychic as a move, the move Psychic, is much better than the move Zen Headbutt. So you don't really want to run a physical attacking Mesprit, which means you're not going to be able to use the physical Drain Punch. You'd much prefer to have Aura Sphere or to have Focus Blast even. Now, in terms of fire coverage, that would also break through a lot of steel types and would actually be better for Pokemon like Corviknight, but all it gets is Fire Punch, which again suffers a similar problem. And again, none of these moves have stab on them because they're a single type, and so they're all going to be very weak coming off of your base 105 unboosted, unmitigated attack stat. So you really don't want to have to rely on those. So the best you've got is like Ice Beam and Dazzling Gleam. You don't even get Moonblast. You do get knockoff, which is cool for ghost types, but that's only if you're running a knockoff set, which is going to be more support oriented. So you have bad coverage. Mesprit usually carves out a niche in the tiers that it's in as a stealth rocker, as a support Pokemon, and even in higher tiers where that niche would somewhat be taken away from it, it always does have Healing Wish as an option. But you're dying, and that's your niche. That's not the greatest niche, but it technically is a niche, and I do have to respect that. Now, Mesprit definitely suffers from competition from all sorts of special attackers like Alakazam and Tapu Lele, and there's no real reason to ever run Mesprit as a result. Now, offensively, Psychic isn't bad typing. It is not the greatest defensive typing, though. However, it's not the worst either, so I would say that's just a mixed problem. Then it is quite reliable, especially because it doesn't have access to Focus Blast, so it can't miss Focus Blast. And its ability and moves are not banned. However, let's look at its ability Levitate. That is not helping a Psychic type. There are quite a few Psychic types actually that have Levitate, which makes Mesprit stand out even less. Aside from, of course, its companions in Azelf and Uxie, you have things like Chimecho and Cresselia. And why do all these Psychic types have to have Levitate? Abra levitates, and it doesn't have that as an ability. So it doesn't really need to have that ability. I really wish it had something different. How would I fix Mesprit? First of all, give Mesprit fire and fighting coverage, right? Give it Flamethrower, give it Focus Blast. All of a sudden, Mesprit would be way better just with those two moves, because then at least it would be able to hit a lot of Pokemon that normally can't, and could even make it all the way up to maybe Aryu, I would say, at the very least. Now, it also got a new move in Legends Arceus called Mystical Power, and this is somewhat of an interesting move. We don't know how it will perform, though, in the main game, and so I put a question mark next to it. I don't think that move in and of itself will fix Mesprit, but I think it is something to consider, as it will get a new toy. And finally, it needs to have a new ability. It needs to have something besides Levitate. A bit tricky to do that, but you could always give it a hidden ability in some kind of an event, and then just every time you used it from then on, it would have that ability, because you would never want to use Levitate after it got a good ability. So that's Mesprit. Let's go on to a different Psychic type now. Galarian Articuno. Galarian Articuno is another legendary Pokemon, and another Pokemon that hits a nice big 580 stat. But similarly to Mesprit, it suffers from having a lack of coverage, and it doesn't really have a niche either, as opposed to Mesprit, which at least has niches in the tiers it's in. Galarian Articuno is just one of those Pokemon that likes to hit hard, and that's about it. So if you look at its stats, it's got 125 special attack, which is good. Its SPDF is fine at base 100. Its HP is only serviceable, 90 is fine, but since it barely breaks 100 SPDF, right? 90 HP plus 100 SPDF isn't really that great, and 85 defense isn't great either. And 95 speed is that similarly awkward tier where it's not bad, but it's not good either. Competitive as an ability is a unfortunate one for Galarian Articuno, because I guess a Pokemon with Intimidate would proc that, and Defog definitely procs it, but it's very rare besides those two instances to get a stat drop on Articuno, and so you're barely ever going to see that happen. And so as a result, Galarian Articuno basically just doesn't have an ability as a result. Now, aside from not having a defined niche, just, being a strong special attacker, it doesn't have coverage. It has a bunch of psychic moves, right? It's got Future Sight, got Size Shock, even has Freezing Glare, which is a really cool move. But now I'm just choosing between all sorts of psychic moves. It's got Hurricane, which is fun, but it's unreliable because it has poor accuracy outside of rain. And besides that, it doesn't have anything. So as you can see on this set here, it has to run Shadow Ball. Sometimes it runs U-Turn as well. And that really just goes to show that it's got major problems. This is another Pokemon that would really like to have fire coverage, like Heat Wave. Lots of flying types have Heat Wave. This Articuno is not a nice type. It could definitely have Heat Wave if it wanted to. Alternatively, use Focus Blast or Aura Sphere, and that would make it so that it could deal with Steel types. But as it stands, it cannot touch Steel types in any way, shape, or form. Roost would also be useful. Now, it's well known that the Galarian birds did not get recovery outside of Articuno getting recover, and so Articuno is sort of funny to say give it Roost when it is the only one that got any form of recovery. But recover itself is not the greatest move. It has low PP, and Roost is superior because it will mitigate a flying weakness. So giving it Roost would give it more longevity. And overall, Articuno just needs more options, right? Give it more support moves, give it more moves in general so that it can have things to play around with. If it had something like Nasty Plot and Heat Wave and Freezing Glare and maybe Air Slash or Hurricane, then that would be an interesting special attacking set. It still maybe wouldn't be OU because there's just too much competition there, but it could maybe be UU, I think. It just needs to have a few more tweaks to it to actually hit certain threats that otherwise completely make it irrelevant. Next up, we've got Dusknoir. Dusknoir is another monotype Pokemon. It's pure Ghost, and as a pure Ghost, it's sort of an awkward position. It doesn't really have problems when it comes to coverage, because it's got Fire Punch and Ice Punch, and it's got Drain Punch, I believe even. Or no, it does not get Drain Punch. It's got Poltergeist this gen, which is cool, and it's got a bunch of neat options like Will-O-Wisp and Pain Split, which give it some support utility as well. But if I am playing in singles specifically, it's difficult for me to get off any support moves if I'm so slow. Now, Dusknoir is quite tanky with his stats. You can see 135 on both his defense and SpDef. It only has base 45 HP, so even though it's able to take a hit, because it doesn't have very many hit points, the hit is still going to be very strong on it. And as a result, Dusknoir is going to die pretty quickly. Now, Pokemon like Toxapex can sometimes make stat spreads like this work, where you have low HP but high defenses. The difference is Toxapex has good defensive typing, and Ghost is not the greatest defensive typing. Lots of Pokemon have knockoff, lots of Pokemon are able to deal with Ghost types, either with Ghost or Dark moves, and Ghost doesn't really resist very much, so you're going to be getting hit from left and right, and because you're so slow, you can't really do much about that. Your attack stat similarly means that you're not going to be able to deal out much damage, so you're going to be a very passive Pokemon, and 100 is not a great attack stat. And Dusknoir in its original generation even barely made it to OU, and after that immediately fell off hard. And Dusknoir just since then has been plummeting as Pokemon have become increasingly strong, increasingly bulky, and able to recover off damage that maybe Pain Split would do or Will-O-Wisp, and just Dusknoir doesn't have any useful options that would make it stand out. Ghosts, there are lots of ghosts like Mismagius, Golurk, that are going to hit harder or hit better and are going to be way faster than Dusknoir. And Dusknoir under Trick Room, you would say maybe then it could stand out, but again, that base 100 stat is not good attack stat. You've got to be at least 120, and Trick Roomers generally want to be even stronger than that, because Trick Room takes the turn to set up, and you have to get value added for wasting that turn. And sometimes you even waste 2 turns if you have to set it up and then switch out. So you really have to be hitting hard and getting a kill on every turn, otherwise you are not going to be a good Trick Room Pokemon, and Dusknoir with a base 100 attack stat is not that Pokemon. So it has 525 base stat total, and that's fine, but overall those stats just are not where they need to be, right? It needs to have a higher attack stat, or it needs to have higher HP stat to become a more defensive Pokemon. If you make it a more defensive Pokemon, it needs to have some form of recovery. It could have Drain Punch, but I don't think if you lowered its attack stat that would be a good option. Give it a Recover, give it Slack Off, something like that it can actually have some form of longevity. Also, it needs to have a new ability. Pressure could be a decent ability on a bulky Pokemon that's trying to eat away at your PP. No, not really this Pokemon. As opposed to something like Suicune or Zapdos, it can't really threaten you passively with a move or an ability that's going to get off damage or make it so that you can't hit it without getting staticked. It has to go for Will-O-Wisp, which only affects certain Pokemon and generally doesn't get as much chip off as it used to. So that's not really the greatest. And Frisk itself is not a good ability other than maybe, you're in draft or you're really trying to scout something, but then even then there are better Frisk Pokemon like Noivern. So overall, Frisk, not a good ability. Pressure, not particularly good. I think it could use something like Iron Fist. If you give it Iron Fist, then I could run Drain Punch if you gave me Drain Punch too. Drain Punch, Ice Punch, Fire Punch, and Shadow Punch. And then that could be something. Just as an example. And then give me more attack if you can do that, right? Give me more attack and maybe lower my SpDef. And then that would be something I could see Dusknoir being better. Still don't think it would be that great, but it would work. Next up is a funny one. Magneton is not a fully evolved Pokemon, and as a result, you might say, well, why is it on this list? Well, Magneton actually performs a special role in competitive Pokemon where it acts as a trapper. It has the ability Magnet Pull, which allows it to trap Steel types, and this is a very valuable ability, especially because certain Steel types can be quite annoying. And this is why Magnezone, even to this generation, has persisted in OU, because the ability to trap Steel types to allow Psychics or Dragons or other Pokemon like that to sweep after removing said Steel types is invaluable, and that ability and that niche alone makes Magneton, Magnezone quite good Pokemon. Now in previous generations, Magneton was already all the way up to UU, but in this generation, Magneton has fallen all the way down. And you sort of have to take a hard look at the tiers to figure out why. Now in UU, Magneton doesn't have as many Pokemon to trap as it did in previous generations. Pokemon like Empoleon were in the tier, and Magneton could easily deal with them. And now those are gone because of Dexit, and then other Pokemon that are in the tier can threaten it, like Celesteela can have Earthquake and things like that. So Magneton is not quite as reliable of a trapper as it would like to be. And then as you go down in tiers, Pokemon like Steelix obviously don't care, and even Pokemon like Sakataka and Registeel, they can shrug off your hits. You go down more tiers and it continues, it's just bad all the way down. So since Magneton doesn't really have anything to trap, right now it's just sort of hanging out at the bottom of the barrel. It still has a quite respectable 120 special attack stat, and it has rolls. First of all, if you ever need to get anything trapped, it can still do that, and it can be strong with Analytic. Additionally, technically it is fast in the Magnezone, but usually that's not enough to justify dropping Magnezone over Magneton. So that's just something to consider. It is technically fast in the Magnezone. So how would I fix Magneton? I don't think it's necessary. Magneton's a not fully evolved Pokemon. We shouldn't expect the not fully evolved Pokemon to be at the top of the metagame when the Pokemon it evolves into is at the top of the metagame. So I'm not concerned about this one. But it is just sort of funny to note that this Pokemon was quite good and all of a sudden dropped down because the Pokemon it's meant to trap weren't available. And if in a future generation there's a tier that has Steel types that Magneton is good at trapping, I think you will see Magneton rise back up in order to trap those, right? Let's say UU next generation has Skarmory, has Empoleon, has maybe a couple other Pokemon that are Steel and that are easily abused by Magneton. Maybe Magneton gets hidden power fire back, and Scizor is also in that tier. And I think Magneton would rise back up to UU because it does have a valuable niche. And that's just an example of a Pokemon that might currently be bad, but isn't necessarily bad because of its inherent properties, but just because of the metagame surrounding it. That's why I wanted to include Magneton on this list. Next up is another funny Pokemon, Basculin. Basculin is going to evolve into Basculegion if that comes to the main games, and at that point Basculin will no longer be a bad Pokemon because it can evolve into Basculegion. Now Basculin has a decent speed stat at 98. Still doesn't hit 100, which is what you generally want to hit at the very least, but 98 isn't too bad. Does that speed those base 95s? But its attacking stats leave something to be desired. 92 is not great, and 80 is pretty bad. And the only reason we worry about his special attack is because a lot of its moves that it wants to use are special attacks, specifically Ice Beam. Sometimes you actually even see a fully special Basculin with Hydro Pump. And if that's the case, then it would be a bit more unreliable. But generally that's not the case. And so it generally doesn't have too many problems with unreliability because it usually runs fully physical sets. Now, I'm going to specify the red Basculin because the red Basculin is the best Basculin. All Basculin run adaptability, and all Basculin have adaptability, so it really is up to you which one you want to use. But Mold Breaker, which is on all of them as well, is another option, which is another fantastic ability, and the only reason you don't run it is because 92 attack is not great, and you'd rather have adaptability to boost that up. Finally, Reckless is the reason to use red over any of the others, because Reckless is superior to Rattled or Rockhead. And Reckless means you do more damage, but you only do more damage on recoil moves, and Basculin doesn't really have that many recoil moves. So that means that you generally only see adaptability on Basculin. However, all three of Basculin's abilities are great, and I just wanted to point out that you can have a bad Pokemon with fantastic potential, but there are just certain things holding it back. The main, most obvious thing that's holding Basculin back is his bad BST. 460 base stat total, pretty bad, right? If you gave it 500 BST, that'd be 40 extra points. You could toss that all into attack, and all of a sudden it would have 132 attack. 132 attack would be great, and 98 speed would be quite good as well. And I think that would be all it needs to become a glass cannon, right? You could definitely do that. Of course, they're not going to because they made Basculegion, but that's just an example of how a Pokemon could have amazing potential, but with just bad BST, can't do anything as a result. Of course, Basculin also has only a single typing. That'll get fixed with Basculegion, and it doesn't really have a good niche. It is a water type that hits hard, but there are lots of water types that hit hard. You know, most of them have multiple typings as well. And Pokemon like Urshifu, for instance, has a similar speed tier and hits harder with Surging Strikes and Close Combat, and has U-Turn to compensate for Flip Turn. So really, there's no reason to run Basculin when you can run Urshifu. That's just one example. And then, of course, Power Creep is there, but it's hard to even justify Power Creep when it started off with 460 in Generation 5. Our Basculin just came out of the box pretty bad. Now, one other thing that Basculin will get when Legends Arceus things transfer over is Wave Crash. We don't know how Wave Crash will transfer into the main game. You can only speculate, and there are some good speculations out there, but Wave Crash could be a very useful move for Basculin, and specifically the red one, because it does have Reckless, and Wave Crash is a recoil move, which means that you might actually be able to get really strong Wave Crashes off. And if, for instance, Wave Crash is a priority move, which it may very well be, since it raises your speed in Legends Arceus, and that's the same thing that things like Quick Attack do. If Wave Crash is a priority recoil move, then Reckless Basculin could become a thing. But it's also quite likely that Basculin will become not a thing at all once Basculegion comes out. Although that remains to be seen still. Alright, Jolteon. Jolteon is the first evolution on this list, and most of the evolutions are quite bad. Umbreon is generally considered to be the best evolution, followed shortly behind by Sylveon and then Vaporeon. And basically all the other evolutions are quite bad, and Jolteon is one of the ones that I wish were better, but has actually only been getting worse as generations have gone on. First of all, 110 special attack, not very good. Now, Jolteon wants to be a glass cannon, that's fine, but 110 is not a cannon, that's a light tickle. 130 speed is very good, and is actually Jolteon's standout feature is that it can outspeed quite a few Pokemon. However, Jolteon doesn't really hit very hard, so even if it's going to outspeed you, it doesn't really do that much. And Jolteon is probably going to outspeed most Pokemon, but if it can't hit those Pokemon at all, then that's an even bigger problem, and that gets into Jolteon's biggest issue, which is its lack of coverage. Now, Jolteon, even before this generation, had to rely on Hidden Power Ice and Signal Beam. You don't want to have to rely on Signal Beam. And Signal Beam was removed in this generation, and as well as Hidden Power, so Jolteon has nothing. Jolteon has nothing to hit Pokemon with. Umbreon doesn't care about having no coverage because Umbreon is a defensive Pokemon. Vaporeon doesn't care about having no coverage because it's a defensive Pokemon. Sylveon actually got coverage this generation because Game Freak loves Sylveon, but they didn't give anything to Jolteon. So Jolteon is far inferior to something like Raikou. Raikou is just clearly a step up in every way. It's a little bit slower, but it's far bulkier. It's got way more special attack. It has Aura Sphere, Scald, and it can actually hit ground types. So no reason whatsoever to ever use Jolteon for just about anything. Jolteon could run Baton Pass, but that's banned, and even as a Baton Passer, it's inferior to other Pokemon. So overall, Jolteon has nothing going for it. Jolteon's abilities aren't great either. Volt Absorb is a mediocre ability for an electric type to have. It could have better abilities out there. And Quick Feet just makes it faster, which is not something Jolteon was asking for. So overall, nothing is going Jolteon's way. It's a single attacker, or a single type attacker, which of course all evolutions are single type, and so we can't fault him too much for that. But it is still a problem because it's not going to get stabbed on any coverage moves if it got any. And it doesn't have a niche because it can't really do much of anything at all. Now, it has bad defensive typing, it has bad offensive typing as well, technically, because it has no stats at all. Really, this Pokemon doesn't really have anything going for it. I will say it's not unreliable. It will hit its attacks when you click it because it has Thunderbolt and that's about it. So that's nice, I guess. If we wanted to fix it, it's got to have coverage. Anything, please, just give us anything on Jolteon, really. And I think it would be nice to give it a better ability, right? Get rid of Quick Feet, give it something. Don't give it Levitate because that doesn't make any sense. But even something like Iron Barbs could be something more useful than what it currently has. I don't think that would be a good ability, and I definitely wouldn't fix it. But literally anything better is better than what it has right now. Volt Absorb is an okay ability in the sense that it can block Volt Switch, but then Jolteon is going to be hitting you with an electric move because that's all it has, so it isn't really conducive to Jolteon's playstyle. Alright, another Gen 1 Pokemon. We've got Arcanine up next. Arcanine is a Pokemon that almost was a legendary in the beginning, and nowadays has fallen very hard off because of competition. Now, one thing that we have to note about Arcanine's stat line is that it has stats just about everywhere. 90 basic HP is pretty bulky for HP, especially if you're an attacker. It has 80 in both of his defenses, which isn't great, but with 90 HP, you could make that work. There are Pokemon that can make that work, like Clefable has somewhat of a similar defensive line, and of course Clefable is great, but Clefable has Magic Guard as well as way too many support options available to it to make it good, whereas Arcanine doesn't have any of that. It has 110 attack stat, which is passable, but it does not have a way to make that attack stat stronger. If Arcanine had Sword Stance, well, now we would have an entirely different story, but it can't boost its stats, so that's a problem. Special attack is also quite high, base 100, and I say quite high because even though 100 is actually a pretty bad attacking stat, because you would generally want to be a physical attacker, why am I dumping 100 points into my special attack? It's way too high for a physical attacker. So if you took 50 of those points out from special attack and put them into your attack stat, into your speed stat or something, then Arcanine would be a lot stronger overall. So its base stats are fine, but its allocation leaves something to be desired. Again, it's another fire type. You look at all the other fire types that are out there. You've got Incineroar is another Intimidate user right above it in tiering, and Incineroar has so many other options available to it, as well as better defensive typing. And of course, having extra stab on things. It's got stab knockoff, for instance, is very valuable. Arcanine doesn't really have a fixed role either. It could be a choice banded attacker A lot of people like to run it that way, but it's really not optimal because it gets shut down by quite a few defensive walls or defensive cores and doesn't really have much in the way of breaking power. Again, if it had Swords Dance or something, then it would be able to break, and that would be something to consider at that point. But until it gets something like that, can't really break anything. And then its defensive typing, which often it's used for, is somewhat okay. It can resist fairy, which is fine. It can resist steel, and it's okay overall, but it's not anything to write home about. Intimidate is somewhat useful, but again, it suffers from competition with Incineroar on that front. And as soon as Incineroar comes out, it basically invalidates Arcanine defensively. However, Arcanine does still generally try to run more defensive set because that's really all it has going for it, since it has a hard time breaking through teams offensively. So if we give it a new ability, something to differentiate it, right? Get rid of Justified, for instance. Justified isn't doing anything, or Flash Fire. Why does it have Flash Fire when so many other fire types do that? It'd be a lot nicer to have something that's more interesting on Arcanine. Maybe something like Speed Boost even on Arcanine. Just something to make it more interesting compared to some of the other fire types. Then it wouldn't have as much competition, because then it could find a dedicated niche, as opposed to just sort of wandering around trying to find any role that it can fill. Also, let's redistribute some of the stats. The Legends Arceus who have the Hisuian Arcanine, and Hisuian Arcanine does redistribute the stats a little bit. They actually redistribute them somewhat to his detriment. It takes away some of his special attack, puts it in attack, that's cool. But it also makes it slower, which I think is worse for Arcanine. So overall, both of the Arcanines are struggling in the stat distribution department. But we're only considering the main one here because that's the only one that we've actually had in the main games. And this one definitely needs a bit of work. We're sticking with Gen 1 for the next Pokemon on the list. We've got Starmie, and Starmie is one of my favorite Gen 1 Pokemon. It's a fun special attacker. It's got lots of different moves in its arsenal. It has a couple of good abilities. It's got Natural Cure and Analytic. It also has one awful ability in Eliminate. So overall, I guess a mixed bag there. Natural Cure is an okay ability for it. It offers some defensive utility, and with moves like Recover and Rapid Spin, Starmie is a Pokemon that can offer somewhat of a defensive option. But if we look at its stats, you can see that it only has 60 HP and 85 in defenses, which isn't particularly good. So I don't think Starmie in this generation is particularly good defensively. In previous generations, that stat line might have been more serviceable, but in this generation, Pokemon have gotten way stronger, and at this point, that is not really going to work for defensive Pokemon. Analytic is a good offensive option, but only if you get to move second. So either one, I have to force my opponent to switch, in which case they're going to switch into something that ostensibly beats my Starmie, so either I have to predict them, or I don't get off an attack and I switch out. So Analytic is a mixed bag when it comes to offering any offensive power. However, it is something that Starmie can avail itself of, and Analytic Hydro Pumps do hit quite hard. His speed stat is pretty good. 115 is definitely a very good speed stat. Still is going to get outsped by Zeraora, still going to get outsped by Dragapult, and those Pokemon are going to obliterate Starmie. But 115 is going to outspeed a majority of the metagame, and so you can't really complain about it. The special attack, though, I will complain about. 100 special attack is not very good, so that's a bit unfortunate. Now, it has some defensive stats that don't necessarily need to be there. I think you could get rid of maybe its defense or its SPDF and just make this more of a glass cannon character. I think that would be more useful in today's metagame and would make Starmie actually able to be used again. Otherwise, it's just going to be a middling Pokemon because it doesn't have much in the way of power. It doesn't get nasty plot, so it doesn't get to boost up and be super strong. Now, the role that Starmie can fill that is a good niche is being a Rapid Spinner. Rapid Spin gets rid of Stealth Rock, Spikes, Sticky Web, and that's very useful for Pokemon in competitive, specifically singles, because VGC doesn't usually have entry hazards, but singles very much does, and Starmie can fulfill that role quite well. But despite having a niche, is not necessarily a unique niche, and so it still does have competition from a variety of spinners. And as a psychic and water attacker, it has a lot of competition there as well. Offensively, of course, we've got Pokemon like Alakazam. And then, of course, defensively, there's no reason to use Starmie defensively when you have Pokemon like Slowbro and Slowking. So it doesn't really have a good standout option on either side. Starmie is also quite unreliable if you're using Hydro Pump. Now, if you're using Surf, that's fine, and actually at that point, Starmie is quite reliable as an attacker. But because it only has that 100 base attack stat to work with, then it doesn't really hit very hard with Surf. So you really need Hydro Pump to get certain KOs, and at that point, the reliability factor goes down quite a bit for Starmie. Starmie also could use some Focus Blast in its life, which would make its reliability worse, but at least if it could hit certain Pokemon coming in it needs that fighting type coverage for, then that would definitely help. Having Illuminate, if Illuminate worked the way I would like it to, and you can watch my other video on bad abilities to see how I would like Illuminate to work, if that actually boosted accuracy, then Focus Blast, Hydro Pump, though they would become more accurate, and that would aid in its reliability, and at that point I think Starmie could be a bit more interesting overall. Another water type that is a bad Pokemon is Politoed. Now Politoed, let's look at its stats first before anything else. Look at those stats. It's 500 base stat total, which is pretty middle of the road. It's not great, and it could be improved, but overall, what's going on here? It's got 75 attack, and it's not using its attack stat. So you could take some away from that. Where are we going to put it? I don't know. It's got a decent HP stat, and with its SPDF stat of 100, it is decently SPDF tanky. So it can tank a few special hits, but it's not running Calm Mind, so it's not getting boosts to its SPDF. So if a special attacker is boosted at all of a sudden Politoed is not going to be able to eat those hits very well. And its special attack stat, which is the attacking stat that Politoed usually uses, is pretty bad at 90. 90 is a bad attack stat for a Pokemon in the OU tier that it wouldn't use it, right? So something like Garchomp then have something like a 90 base special attack stat, and it just wouldn't bother using that usually because it's not that good. Every once in a while it does. Actually, I think it even might be higher than 90. 90 is really not a good attack stat. If you have to attack off your 90, you better be bulky, right? You better be Toxapex or something that can eat hits, because you're not going to be dishing out hits in any way, shape, or form. And Politoed is not that bulky, so it really just has this middle-of-the-road stat distribution that doesn't do anything particularly well, or well at all, frankly. Its defense stat isn't particularly good either, and its speed, if you're going to be slow and fat, well then just get rid of that speed. Base 70 is too fast for a bulky Pokemon, but it's way too slow for anything else. So, really awkward speed tier as well. It also has a single typing, which does not help, and its coverage is pretty bad. Right? You got Ice Beam, cool, that's about it. Scald, Ice Beam, and then that's fine generally if you like were Vaporeon, for instance, because you're not necessarily concerned about your coverage, you're worried about your support moves. And Politoed does have a few support moves in its arsenal, but not too many, and not when you compare it to its competition. Now, its competition, of course, everybody knows, is Pelipper. Now, if you play VGC, you might think that, oh no, Politoed is way better than Pelipper at being a rain setter, and I would agree. We're not talking about VGC, we're talking about singles, and singles Pelipper is far superior. And one of the main reasons why is that it's got three main components: Roost, U-turn, Defog. Roost allows it to have longevity outside of rest. Politoed wants to have longevity, but it has to run rest. In order to have that, you can run rest with Chesto, but then you don't have the Damp Rock, so you're going to have to just be asleep. And at that point, you have a sleeping water setter. That's not great. Roost is way better. U-turn allows you to get the rain up and get out on the same turn, which is incredibly invaluable. And Defog is a more reliable and useful form of support move. Politoed has things like Toxic or Encore or Hypnosis, and those are things that Pelipper does not have. But Hypnosis misses, toxic is not anything to write home about. Tons of Pokemon get toxic. And Encore, oftentimes you don't need Encore. Frankly, it would be a lot better to have a move that you need more often. And you often need Defog. So overall, Pelipper has far more useful options and has dual stab, so it can run Hurricane even if it wants and actually hit quite hard with that. Politoed really does not have much going for it. If you wanted to make it be able to compete at all, give it U-turn or flip turn, and then it can also do a similar thing to Pelipper where it can get in, get out in the same turn. Giving it any kind of coverage would also differentiate it in any way, shape, or form. I don't know what that would look like, but give it maybe like Freeze Dry or something, and then that would be something that would differentiate it. Finally, if you can't differentiate it, at least resign yourself to be able to use it in UU or in RU. Because Drizzle is banned in lower tiers, Politoed can't use its ability in lower tiers, and as a result, its ability is banned, and now it falls all the way down. So if it could use Drizzle in UU, then Politoed would be a UU Pokemon, because Drizzle is quite a valuable ability. And we saw in Gen 5 that Politoed was just fine being an OU Pokemon because the rain was so good. But as soon as Pelipper came along, it made Politoed completely useless because it's just far superior to run Pelipper in every capacity. But if I'm in a tier that doesn't allow Pelipper, but it does allow Politoed and Rain is allowed, then I'm going to run Politoed because Rain is still quite a good playstyle. So I think that if you allowed Rain in UU, then Politoed all of a sudden magically would be a UU Pokemon because Rain is just that good. Flapple is one of my favorite Pokemon from this generation. Really fun design, and it is really interesting to play with, but it has a few problems. First of all, let's look at its base stat total. It has 110 attack, which is not great, and it has 70 speed, which is really quite bad. And if you look at its base stat total, it's 485. So that indicates to me the Game Freak didn't want this to be a good Pokemon. They wanted it to be more just a curiosity, an odd Pokemon that you can use if you really are feeling funny, but is not going to be that threatening and competitive. And it sort of makes sense. It's just a little apple worm, and facing off against some of these big behemoth Pokemon, how is little apple worm supposed to do anything? But at the same time, if you want this Pokemon to be usable, you've got to give it the tools to succeed, and they really did not do that. So if you look at its special attack stat as base 95, why does it have a 95 special attack stat? It's never going to use that. If you just swap its special attack and its speed, all of a sudden it would have been faster. I think that would have made a lot more sense as well. Like this little fast apple dude, it should be able to go faster than base 70. So if you just swap that, then that would have been much better allocation of the resources that you're willing to give to Flapple. Now, Grass Dragon is sort of interesting typing. Grass does allow you to hit things like Tapu Fini, which is nice. And Dragon, of course, is nice to spam once all the fairies are gone, but you're still completely walled out by steel types, and so that's something you have to consider. So, if we look at Flapple and what it has as coverage, it does not have anything for those steel types. It does not have a fighting move, does not have a fire move despite being a dragon. So if this had Flare Blitz or Close Combat, all of a sudden we would have a different story, because then it could deal with steel types. But because it has really bad coverage overall, Sucker Punch I don't really count as coverage, and then Acrobatics and a couple other weird moves that don't really contribute much. Overall, Flapple doesn't really have much going for it. And one of the saddest parts about Flapple is its abilities. So Ripen is a really cool ability, but it doesn't really do too much because you have to substitute down to get anything interesting like a Salac Berry or a I don't know what other kind of berry you'd want to use. Maybe something to give you more attack, or the Landsat berry. I don't even know what you'd want to use on Flapple, and you could get double the amount of the berry that you wanted. And that's cool, but you have to substitute down to 25% to get that. And that's a major problem. If you have Gluttony, you don't have to worry about the 25%. You only have to take down to 50% and you'll get your berry. But on the flip side of that, the fact is that Flapple is pretty frail, 70 HP, 60 SPDF, 80 defense, and his typing is not particularly good defensively, meaning that it will take a lot of hits pretty badly, and it might be difficult to get it into the proper range without just getting it dead. So gotta watch out for that. Hustle, of course, is the ability that's going to give it some form of power. And that's really what we need. With only 110 base attack, you need power. But Hustle makes it unreliable because it really messes with your accuracy of your moves. So now you're missing all your moves. And if you have a heightened chance to miss your moves, that means this Pokemon is just suboptimal out of the gate. I want to have a Pokemon that is strong and can hit its moves, and Flapple doesn't offer anything on the support end of things. It's just a Pokemon that does damage and uses raw stats to do it. It has Sucker Punch, and that's about it. As a Dragon type, it has Dragon Dance, and so it'll often use Dragon Dance. In fact, generally it uses Dragon Dance. And how many Dragon types are there? A lot. Like 80% of Dragon types get Dragon Dance or whatever. So in that regard, Flapple does not stand out from the crowd either. So it's unreliable, doesn't really have a niche, and struggles both offensively and even defensively. You got to deal with things like Ice Shard, just one-shotting you out of the blue. And that's a major problem. So, especially in the OU tier, where Weavile is not going to take much from Sucker Punch, right? So Flapple overall needs a lot of work. It needs to have coverage moves. It needs to have a fire move like Flare Blitz or Close Combat as a fighting move. Of course, those moves maybe don't make too much sense for it to have, but until it gets moves like those, it can't break through steel types at all. Things like Core of Night just going to come and sit on you for days. You can't do a thing about it. Its ability needs to be better. Get rid of Gluttony. Gluttony makes sense for Appleton, but Flapple is a little skinny boy. Give it something that's better than Hustle. And then finally, switch its special attack and speed. That whole special attack is criminal. You're wasting so many stat points there when you barely gave Flapple any in the first place. And you could definitely give it 95 base speed, and all of a sudden Flapple would be just that more usable. Another Dragon type that struggles right out of the gate is Guzzlord. Guzzlord came out Gen 7 and immediately was really bad, where all the other beast boosters, right, all the Ultra Beasts were quite good. Hermos was banned, Nihilego was good, later Naganadel came out and was banned, and Blacephalon almost was banned there for a second. Stakataka fell down quite a bit. It's also quite slow. Even Stakataka has a decent niche. But Guzzlord is a really sad Pokemon because it has a really bad weakness in Fairy type, and when you can't do much damage to those Fairy types, depending on their typing, you really are struggling, right? Guzzlord does have Gunk Shot, and it does have Heavy Slam, and both of those are really strong against a lot of Fairy types. So I'm not going to take that away from it. But you have to predict those. Otherwise, you're going to die from almost any Fairy type move. Let's see why that is. If we look at its base stat total, got 570 total. That's a really decent base stat total, but most of that got dumped into the HP stat. And if we look at the defensive stats, it only has base 53. And the way this is going to work is that the amount of attack versus your defense is going to calculate how much damage I will do, and then I'm going to remove a certain amount of hit points. Okay, a Guzzlord has a lot of hit points, meaning that it has a lot of hit points to spare. That will make it bulkier, but ultimately, if those defensive stats are quite low, then I'm going to be doing lots more damage to those hit points than I would be if those defensive points were higher. So I'd rather have low HP and high defenses personally than have high HP and low defenses. So that's not great. Then its attack is 101 and its special attack is 97. These are all really weird numbers. The reason for that is because all of the Ultra Beasts have prime numbers as their stats. So that's why they all look funky, because they're all prime numbers. But 101, not good. 97, not good. Why did we have to make this a mixed attacker when we could have just given it one and then made it a stronger attacker, right? But Guzzlord's going to have a difficult time getting off a lot of damage in one hit, even though a lot of its moves are quite powerful, right? It's got Knockoff, it's got Outrage, it's got Heavy Slam, which is quite heavy, so it's very strong. It's got Gunk Shot. It's got some other moves that I'm not thinking off the top of my head. But ultimately, it doesn't hit as hard as it could. Beast Boost is an interesting move because it will boost one of its attacking stats, because none of those other stats are good enough to boost. And its attacking stats getting boosted in theory is cool, because then it could do something in the next turn to hit harder. But its speed stat is so low that everything that's going to come in on it will revenge kill it. It has very bad defensive typing. It's going to be weak to fighting types, it's going to be weak to fairy types, it's going to be weak to ice types, it's going to be weak to bug types even, which is sort of funny. So really, it doesn't take very much to have a Pokemon to come in and scare out Guzzlord, which means it doesn't get to use its Beast Boosts very often, unless the team it's fighting is also very slow or very stally. So a few things we could do to mitigate this. I don't know if it would ever fix it, but to mitigate it. First one, obviously, is unrealistic. We could get rid of fairy typing. That would help a lot. That is unrealistic, though. That's not going to happen, so we can't do that. Another one we could do, give it Trick Room. There are a few attackers that are sort of like Guzzlord that have Trick Room. Alolan Exeggutor and Stack Attacker both came out in the same generation, and they have a similar niche of being very slow, very susceptible to 4 times damage, but they have Trick Room by themselves, and they can set Trick Room and then get a sweep going. And with Guzzlord getting Beast Boosts, I think that if it had Trick Room by itself, all of a sudden it could get off little mini sweeps, and that would be far better. The last thing is if they had taken the HP stat and made it a little bit smaller and then put a bit more into the defenses. I think that would have helped a bit in terms of the calcs. But ultimately, I think giving a Trick Room is probably the best we can hope for at this point. Other than that, I don't really think Guzzlord has much hope in the future. Another evolution is up next. We've got Espeon. Espeon is not the worst evolution, but it's definitely not the best. If we look at its special attack, it has a respectable 130 special attack. However, it doesn't really have a good way to boost. It has Calm Mind, but it doesn't have Nasty Plot, so boosting is going to be very slow. And if you look at its defenses stats, it's got 65 HP, 60 defense, so it can't mess around for too long before Pokemon are going to knock it out. So it has to get those stat boosts fast. And so I think something like Nasty Plot could definitely help Espeon be stronger. Even though it has 130, that's respectable. It could definitely use more. It has 110 speed, which is just barely good, I would say. I would say 110 is a very good speed tier. It could be better, of course. 111 is sort of the magic number. Once you hit 111, you're faster than most everything. And you'll still be outsped by Dragapult, you'll still be outsped by Zeraora. But you take what you can get, and 110 is very good. However, you don't have much else in the way of anything else. So you're going to have to be a glass cannon. And if you're not cannoning properly, then you're not going to be very strong. Now, Espeon has 2 abilities. Synchronize is nothing to write home about, and Magic Bounce is. And Magic Bounce actually defines Espeon as a Pokemon. Espeon is able to bounce back hazards, able to bounce back taunts, and any status move that you try to throw at Espeon, it will get thrown back in your face. A very strong ability. It helps it set up Light Screen and Reflect, because if you try to defog those, I will bounce back defog. And if you didn't know, defog does not get rid of your own screens, it only gets rid of your opponent's screens. So that allows it to block screen removal, which is a very good thing. And one of Espeon's sets that it does run is a dual screen support set. But that set is one that can be ran by very many other Pokemon and is not limited to Espeon. So Espeon really is only there for the Magic Bounce part of its ability. However, even then it suffers from competition with Pokemon like Hatterene, which have dual typing, which Espeon does not have, and have other options available to them that would make them stand out. And Magic Bounce is a good ability, but it's definitely not a required ability. It's more of a gimmick more than anything, and is only really useful on teams that really do not want hazards up. And especially with the introduction of heavy-duty boots in Generation 8, Magic Bounce has become a much less useful ability, as Pokemon like Charizard or Volcarona no longer are scared of Stealth Rock because they can just come in with the heavy-duty boots. And so Stealth Rock and Spikes and other hazards have definitely become weaker as a result. Espeon definitely also suffers from not having Focus Blast, although I really do not like Focus Blast as a move. Psychic attackers and fairy types also need Focus Blast or some kind of fighting coverage to be able to break through steel types. Otherwise, they will not ever be able to be good. And Espeon does not have Focus Blast. It does not have Moonblast either. It only has Dazzling Gleam. So the Psychic Dazzling Gleam combo is the best it can hope for. Not the worst in the world, but it definitely could have been better. And as a result, it's going to be walled by steel types. And that's just really sad for it. So overall, give it fighting coverage. And I would say I would open that up to give it more support moves. If it had the ability to run more options that would be tricky, then I think that it could have a better time. First of all, Nasty Plot would be fantastic for it because then it could have immediate breaking power. But if I'm able to go into my Blissey and eat a relatively weak Psyshock, and Espeon doesn't have enough damage HP to deal with Seismic Toss, then you're gonna have a problem there. I can go Corviknight and you can't really touch me, and I can hit you with Brave Bird because you're super weak defensively. That's gonna be a problem. And I'm not suggesting that we should run Gravity Espeon with Zap Cannon. That would be really dumb. But something, we could come up with something to make Espeon better. And I think support moves are where you should look for that. Alright, another legendary is up next. We got Virizion. Virizion is a weird Pokemon. First of all, let's look at its stats. It has really bad attack and special attack at base 90. And base 90 is not good. Especially for a legendary Pokemon, you would expect to be able to hit harder, but this Pokemon does not hit hard at all. It has really good Spadef for whatever reason, at base 129, in combination with its 91 HP, which is respectable. It actually can eat 1 or 2 special hits, which is cool, but if it can't do any damage, it's not going to do much in return. And it has pretty bad defense at 72, so it's not going to be able to eat too many defensive hits. As a grass fighting type, it has sort of an awkward position defensively because it is good against certain matchups, but then you are weak to ice, you are weak to fire, you have a 4 times weakness to flying, so you only really do well against very specific threats. So are you an offensive Pokemon? No, for sure you're not. Are you a defensive Pokemon? Sort of, but then you consider what are the other fighting grass types. Breloom has Toxicord Poison Heal. That's a better defensive option. Chestnut, of course, is a much better defensive grass and fighting type. And even Pokemon like the Owl coming out once it comes out from Legends Arceus, right? You can see Decidueye maybe being a better defensive option compared to Virizion. So it really suffers from strong competition. And because it can't do very much damage, it has a big problem actually setting itself apart. Now, if it has support moves like Recover and Heal Bell, things like that, then all of a sudden maybe it could make something work. Synthesis isn't great, low PP. I don't know what you're going to do about that. Give it Recover though, give it Heal Bell, or Aromatherapy, I guess makes more sense. Give it a few things like that. Maybe you could make some kind of bulky support set work. I think that would be an interesting option for Virizion. But either do that or make its stats reallocated to be better. First of all, do we want it to be a physical or a special attacker? A physical Virizion is a bit iffy because you have to hit Stone Edge or risk just being completely walled by flying types. But the special Virizion has to run Focus Blast, which is awful. So, pick your poison on that. I don't know. I think special Virizion with a sub-calm mindset is pretty fun. Then you have Giga Drain, then you have some form of recovery. But again, you have to hit that Focus Blast. If it had Aura Sphere, maybe that would also be good. Finally, give it a better ability. Justified is cool because you can eat the Dark type hits. You are a fighting type, right? As opposed to Arcanine where it's just a waste. you are a fighting type, you can come in and knock off, but that only helps if you're going to run a physical attacking set. And even if you are going to run a physical attacking set, if I have a Pokemon that can wall you because you're so weak, and or you have to hit Stone Edge and I'm a Zapdos and have fun with that, then really what is Verzone going to do, even at +1? So all you did was lose your item at that point. So that's not really great. If you had a better ability that could actually make use of your defensive prowess, or maybe make it so that you can be a better offensive attacker, I don't know which, then that would be something to write home about. But as it stands, Justified is just not that good. Kingdra was a really scary Pokemon back in Generation 2, but since the introduction of Fairy typing and Freeze Dry, defensively Kingdra is pretty bad. Offensively, Kingdra is also fallen off hard. Generally, Kingdra wants to be offensive, but in the past he was also able to eat a hit or two because of its good defensive typing. Now its defensive typing is not as good, so it has to be able to stand on its own merits of its offensive typing or its offensive stats, and it does not have that. You can see that it has 95 both for attack and special attack, and that's pretty bad. If you're below 100, that is bad. And 95 is below 100, so those are bad stats. And speed is at 85, which is not great. That does have the caveat that if you are running this on a Swift Swim team, if you are in Rain, then Kingdra actually does have a pretty respectable speed stat, and that's workable. But that's only if you have Rain available to you. So 540 BST overall is pretty good, but you're just wasting that on so many of your other stats that you don't need. Decide if you want to be a physical or special attacker. Maybe don't have as much defense, I don't know. Make up your mind though, because the way it's working right now, you're not really able to hit anything too hard, and you're not going to outspeed anything outside of Rain. Now, Kingdra actually has two abilities that it uses, Swift Swim and Sniper. The Sniper set, Kingdra is one of the few Pokemon that can actually use the Sniper set to some level of satisfaction, in the sense that it can run Focus Lens, Scope Lens, Focus Energy, plus a Sniper to get 100% accurate, or 100% chance to crit its moves, then has Draco Meteor, which it wants to be able to crit, because then you can ignore the special attack drops. So Kingdra is actually one of the few Pokemon that can do that properly because that is Focus Energy. So that's nice, but that's really a gimmicky set, and if your opponent does not care about your Draco Meteors, or you don't hit your Hydro Pumps, you're going to just lose your Kingdra, and that's going to be the end of that. So that's really sad. Makes it very unreliable, because you have to hit Hydro Pumps, you have to hit Draco Meteors. If you miss those, it's not good for you. You don't have much in the way of coverage either. You have Flash Cannon and Iron Head for the Fairy types, but both of those can be quite weak. You don't have much in the way of boosting options, except for Dragon Dance, which is why Kingdra can run a physical attacking set, but that is generally viewed as being suboptimal. One thing we should note is that while none of its moves or abilities are banned in lower tiers, if we consider Swift Swim Pokemon are much better when you have Drizzle Pokemon on your team, because then you get the Rain up for free, and then these Pokemon have more turns to set up and sweep. And Kingdra could be a very potent threat under a Swift Swim Rain abuse team, but in OU it suffers from too much competition from stronger Swift Swim users like Barraskewda. Not only is Barraskewda much stronger, but it's faster to boot, and so really you want to use Barraskewda and a few other Pokemon like that over Kingdra. But in lower tiers, Kingdra would definitely be used, and so if Politoed, for instance, were allowed in UU, we would see a lot more Kingdra as a result. And so even though its ability is not banned, if another Pokemon's ability is banned, then this Pokemon will suffer as a result. And that's one of the reasons why Kingdra has fallen off so dramatically. We got Glade up next. Glade is a sad Pokemon to see on this list, but it is what it is. Glade has some not great BST. 518 isn't the worst, but also it's not even 520. Could have at least done him that much. Its attack stat is 125, which I would consider on the lower end of being good, but it is still decent. So I'm not complaining about that. What I am complaining about is the base 80 speed. base 80 speed is the same as Gardevoir's, so there's that. But Gardevoir also has Trace, which often can be used to abuse things like Swift Swim or Chlorophyll to suddenly get much faster, and often Gardevoir's niche will be anti-weather. Glade doesn't have such a luxury, and so if you want to run Choice Scarf, that's fine, but base 80 Choice Scarf is not really that great in the OU metagame, especially when Choice Scarfers like Kartana or Tapu Lele are running around, and they're much faster than you naturally, meaning that you just don't have speed anymore, even with a Choice Scarf. That's not great. Additionally, you have to contend with your 4 move slot syndrome. Close Combat, Zen Headbutt, Knockoff, Ice Punch, Shadow Sneak even if you need priority. Glade has quite a few moves, and that makes it seem like it would be a really good Pokemon, but you can only have 4 of them, and you need to have your stab moves on there, and then you only get 1 or maybe 2 other options. And when you have only base 80 speed, you have a hard time getting the sweeps off, so Swords Dance is hard to get off, and once you do get Swords Dance off, if you went into a faster Pokemon, well, now I just die, and my Swords Dance was in vain. And if you don't, then I have a hard time breaking through your team because maybe you're fat and you're toxic, or you burned, or you did whatever. It's very hard to get an opportunity to get a Swords Dance off. And one other thing that's not aiding Glade at all is its abilities. It doesn't really have good abilities at all, and I've talked about those in the past, and I'll probably talk about them in the future. Blade's abilities, not good. Give it a better ability. Reallocate its stats, make it so that it has a higher speed stat, I think would definitely help. If you look at Spidef stat, it has 115 Spidef. Why? If you took that Spidef, put it into speed, and switched those two, then it would be 115 speed stat, and that's actually a very respectable speed stat. It would outspeed tons of stuff. It would actually be very scary at that point. So that would definitely help Glade, I believe. But Glade, other than that, just really struggles to stand out from any other fighting types. Fighting Psychic is okay, but it doesn't really help at the end of the day too much. And there's so many other fighting types out there that do the job way better. Even Medicham technically does the job better than Glade a lot of the time. And so ultimately there's no real reason to use Glade. If you made it fast though, by fast I mean 115 speed, then it would be probably better than Medicham, I believe. And it would actually be able to outspeed a lot of Pokemon, and that would give it a reason to be ran. This one is a sort of a funny one. We've got Ditto. Ditto is only got like 2 problems. First of all, its HP stat is sort of low. That is the whole point of Ditto, right? You want to come in, copy your opponent, copy whatever they've been doing. That's really cool. But you know, you're not quite as strong as they are because you're just a little squishy blob of jello. So you have to depend on your own HP stat, and that means that you're easier to take down usually. And so there's that. But the biggest problem with Ditto is what I've termed as unreliability. And in this case, what that means is that your Ditto is only as strong as your opponent's team. So if your opponent doesn't bring good Pokemon, well, now you don't have a good Pokemon either because your Ditto's bad. If your opponent's Pokemon are bad, one of the few roles that Ditto usually has is copying setup sweepers. If my opponent sets up a Dragon Dance or Swords Dance, my Ditto comes in, copies all those stats, and if I give it a Choice Scarf, it will naturally outspeed my opponent no matter what, and be able to get off those really strong hits that they were trying to hit me with. But if my opponent doesn't bring setup sweepers, then that's a problem because Ditto won't be able to be very strong as a result. Every once in a while, Ditto can also play well against Stall, but that's a little more situational, and against balanced and bulky offense teams, Ditto really does not perform well. So the only thing Ditto really needs is to have an offensive metagame. You may remember back at the beginning of Sword and Shield, Ditto did extremely well because everything was broken with Dynamax, and Ditto was himself broken with Dynamax. So definitely Ditto likes an offensive metagame, and Ditto would be very good if there were an offensive metagame. But once you get out of the Ubers or the OU tier, suddenly the Pokemon get much weaker, and Ditto by proxy gets much weaker, and immediately just plummets all the way to the bottom of the tiering list, because at that point, there's no reason to run Ditto if my opponent's Pokemon are likewise bad. Down to our final two. We've got Phalanx here. Phalanx is one of the funnest Pokemon from Sword and Shield, but look at its stats. It's only got 470. Clearly out of the box, Game Freak didn't want this Pokemon to be particularly good. It's got a bad BST, but it also has a bad stat distribution. It gave it 100 defense when its speed stat was only 75. Definitely could have used more speed, I believe, or more attack. Just really anything, because its attack is bad, its speed is bad, and it didn't need that much defense, frankly. It also has only a single typing. It's going to struggle to stand out from the myriad mono fighting types. There are so many mono fighting types, and Phalanx is only one of them. And even from the beginning, with the limited Pokedex that we had in Galar, we already had multiple fighting types that were far better than Phalanx. It doesn't have a dearth of coverage. It has some moves like First Impression, which is cool, and it does have other moves available to it, but it doesn't have any meaningful coverage. And by meaningful coverage, I mean it doesn't have things like Knock Off or Ice Punch. And as a result, certain Pokemon just are really problematic for it. And of course, its move No Retreat is really cool, but it only gives you +1 to your attack and speed, and since those are the only stats that really matter at the end of the day, then it might as well have just been a Dragon Dance that was worse, and you rather would have Swords Dance or even Dragon Dance, because then you could stack it multiple times, but no Retreat can only be used once, so it's not even that good of a move. Since it can't Omni Boost multiple times, then it doesn't really have a niche going for it. If you want an Omni Boost, just go with Como. It's way better. And it's also unreliable from the sense that Zen Headbutt, Rock Slide, those moves can miss quite a lot, and those are your best coverage options. If your coverage is unreliable, then you as a Pokemon are going to be quite unreliable as well. And your offensive typing, because you're just mono fighting, isn't great. You're going to get walled out by ghosts a lot. Of course, you do have Throat Chop, but that's going to be pretty weak coming off of your not great attack stat, and it's not stab, and it's not that great of a move in the first place. Really bad. It just needs more stats overall, it needs better coverage, more meaningful coverage overall, and I would say give it a better ability. Defiant can be useful. It blocks Intimidate, and you can sometimes get free boosts from Sticky Web or Defog, and that's fine. And that definitely helps you, but overall, if you gave it maybe something like Pure Power, well, all of a sudden that base 100 attack stat is going to shoot up through the roof and actually be a good attack stat. And if we have to resort to Pure Power, I'm desperate. but these are just ways to make these Pokemon better. I'm not suggesting that they would do that. Finally, we've got Orbeetle. Orbeetle is another Gen 8 Pokemon, and this Pokemon is, of course, the Route 1 bug, and you could say that the Route 1 bug isn't supposed to be good. And I know that it's not supposed to be good, but we're just trying to make these Pokemon good, or we're trying to identify why Pokemon are bad. One thing we will note is that the BST is 505, which is far better than most other Route 1 bug Pokemon, so can't complain too much there. However, Orbeetle is still quite bad, and let's identify why. With such a high BST, you could say that it has a lot of stats to work with, but those stats are really weirdly distributed. You've got really high defenses with 110, 120, so that's really nice, and in theory that would make this Pokemon quite bulky, but Bug Psychic is really bad defensive typing. It does help against fighting types, but most fighting types that are worth their salt have knockoff, and you don't want to take a knockoff. And besides fighting types, it doesn't really do too much for you. Similarly, for offensive typing, Debug will help you against dark types, and that's nice. But overall, you don't really do much, and you are again walled by steals offensively. Now, Orbeetle does have Body Press, and so with 110 defense, that is something you can play around with, and I actually think that's one of Orbeetle's better sets. But Orbeetle overall is one of these Pokemon that has so many tools in its bag, but doesn't really excel at using any of them. Orbeetle also has Sticky Web, but there are so many Sticky Web users, and many of them are stronger or are more reliable at getting them up and keeping them up than Orbeetle, and so as a result it doesn't really excel at that and has a lot of competition from those users. As a psychic type, of course, it's not very strong. It only has 80 base special attack, which is outright atrocious, and it has Recover, So you could say that it's a more defensively based Pokemon, but it isn't a poison type, so it can get toxic very easily. It doesn't have aromatherapy or heal bell, which would enable it to bypass said toxic, and it doesn't have toxic of its own, and so it doesn't really excel as a defensive Pokemon either. Finally, bizarrely, it has base 90 speed, which is really high for an offensive Pokemon, and not particularly good, it's really high for a defensive Pokemon, and it's not particularly good for an offensive Pokemon. So it seems like Orbeetle doesn't really know what it wants to do. I think that if it had reallocated its stats to be either very defensive or very offensive, that 505 would have been serviceable. I don't think it would have been OU by any stretch of the imagination, but it definitely could have done something with it. I think if it had some more support options like Toxic and maybe Heal Bell or something, that it would definitely have some more things that it could play around with. Finally, I think giving it a better ability would be very useful. None of its abilities are particularly good. Frisk is okay at best, and that's about as far as that goes. So these are just 20 examples of Pokemon that are bad. Now, why did we go through all of these? Well, hopefully by this point you could identify how these Pokemon are bad and find patterns. So now when you go into the team builder and say, well, why is this Pokemon all the way at the bottom of the list? Hopefully now you can have the tools to identify why these Pokemon are bad, why they aren't going to be used over more prevalently used options. So if you made it this far into this very long video, I'm proud of you. You get a gold star. And if things still don't make sense to you at this point, I'd like to know why not. If they do make sense to you though, then I guess I've done my job and I'm proud of myself. So let me know in the comments below, and I will catch you guys next time.